By the late 1700s, across the rolling hills of the British countryside, new mansions began to rise. Stone walls, marble halls, vast gardens, and glittering chandeliers. But behind the beauty lay a truth that was never carved into their foundations. Much of this wealth did not come from the soil of England. It came from distant colonies. From plantations in the Caribbean. From ports in Africa and Asia. These homes were built with global money long before the world became global. This is the story of colonial wealth in British mansions. Hello and welcome. I hope you are doing well, and thank you for joining me today on this journey through history. In this story, we step behind the walls of grand British estates and uncover the hidden connection between empire and luxury. These mansions were not only homes. They were symbols. They represented power, status, and the rewards of imperial expansion. But every room held echoes from overseas. Every staircase had a shadow. So here is something to think about before we begin. Were these mansions monuments of success, or reminders of wealth taken from faraway lands? The first fortune builders 1700 to 1760. The story begins in a Britain preparing to step into a new world. It is the early 18th century, and trade is expanding faster than ever before. In London, Bristol, Liverpool, and Glasgow, merchants study maps spread across candlelit tables. Their fingers trace sea routes across the Atlantic, through the Caribbean, and toward distant ports in Asia. What happens in these cities will soon reshape the countryside as much as the coastline. Ships leave British harbors loaded with goods meant for markets abroad. Some carry manufactured items. Some carry raw materials. Some return with cargo that changes the landscape of wealth at home. Coffee, sugar, tobacco, cotton, and spices flow back through the docks, filling warehouses and trading floors. Merchants make deals in counting houses, where ink marks the difference between loss and prosperity. Each successful voyage becomes a step towards something larger, a foundation on which fortunes will rise. The new wealth does not stay confined within city limits. It travels. It spreads. Merchants use profits to purchase land, establish estates, and construct homes that announce their arrival into the ranks of the powerful. Across the countryside, new mansions begin to appear. Brick by brick, stone by stone, these houses become symbols of success built on global connections. They stand tall on hills and in valleys, where once only small country houses existed. This is the beginning of Britannia's mansion building age. Roads leading to port cities begin to carry architects, builders, marble, fine furniture, and skilled craftsmen. Stonemasons carve entrances meant to impress. Landscapers shape gardens modeled on European styles. The countryside becomes a gallery of ambition where new identities are constructed in physical form. Inside the cities, change is constant. London's docks expand. Bristol's quays fill with ships waiting for cargo. Liverpool's waterfront becomes a line of warehouses and cranes. Glasgow's merchants develop networks across the Atlantic. Investors meet in coffee houses to exchange news of markets, weather, and opportunity. Every rumor of a successful voyage spreads like a spark across dry tinder, igniting speculation and investment. The world is becoming interconnected, and these merchants are determined to stand at the center of that network. Voyages require capital, so partnerships form. Wealthy families pool resources. Banks extend credit to ambitious traders. Insurance firms grow to protect ships and cargo. The financial fabric of Britain begins to stretch across the seas. Fortunes are made not only by sailing but by supporting the ships that sail. Some merchants invest in plantations overseas, where crops are grown for profit rather than local need. These plantations feed the markets that fill British warehouses. Others invest in shipping routes, purchasing or commissioning vessels to carry cargo. These decisions send ripples through the economy. Shipyards expand. Timber yards grow. Ports become busier. The scale of activity surpasses anything seen in generations past. As the countryside transforms, so does social status. Families that were once unknown become respected, then powerful. Invitations arrive at drawing rooms for meetings, dinners, and negotiations. Wealth begins to dictate influence. These new estate owners enter politics, sponsor projects, and shape the laws that govern trade. Britannia's future elite is not born everywhere, some of it is built, constructed from investment, ambition, and the willingness to take risks across oceans. The contrast between tradition and transformation becomes visible. Older estates stand beside newly built mansions. Ancient family lines mingle with recently wealthy merchants. The countryside, once defined by inheritance alone, is reshaped by capital. Wealth is not only inherited. It can now be earned, expanded, and displayed. The sense of expansion affects culture as well as commerce. Imported goods appear in homes and markets. Tea from Asia becomes common. Coffee houses develop into centers of discussion where politics, business, and trade all intersect. Newspapers begin to print shipping news and market reports. People follow the success of voyages as others might follow theatrical performances or sporting events. By the 1750s, Britain stands on the edge of something larger than itself. Ports are crowded. New homes shine across farmlands. The connection between city and countryside becomes clearer with each passing year. The fortunes built in docks and counting houses become estates that mark the rise of new families. The structure of the country is changing, not through war or decree, but through investment, architecture, and geography. The first fortune builders did not set out to shape history. They set out to make a living, to take a chance, to chase success. To chase success across the sea. Yet the choices they made, the ships they financed, and the estates they built all contributed to a greater shift. Britain began to see itself not just as a kingdom but as a participant in a world economy. It began to understand that power could stretch across oceans. By 1760, the pattern is undeniable. Trade feeds wealth. Wealth purchases land. Land produces influence. Influence shapes policy. Policy enables further trade. The cycle becomes a system that will support Britannia's rise in the century to come. The first fortune builders stand at the beginning of that story, their lives and decisions forming the roots of what will become a global power. Their success did not stay in the cities. It moved outward. It settled into the countryside. It raised walls. It planted gardens. It paved roads. It built estates meant to last for centuries. It marked the moment when Britannia's future was no longer defined only by what lay within its borders, but by what lay across its horizons. In 1757, a battlefield in Bengal reshaped the future of an empire. The Battle of Plassey marked the rise of the East India Company from a trading presence to a territorial power. What followed was not simply a military victory. It was the opening of a financial artery that connected India to Britain. Between 1757 and 1800, revenues, taxes, and commercial profits began to flow steadily toward London. The company learned to rule not only with muskets and treaties, but with ledgers, contracts, and streams of revenue that transformed British fortunes. India, once a destination for trade, became a source of wealth. Bengal was the foundation of this transformation. One of the richest regions of the subcontinent, known for its fertile land and bustling ports and skilled artisans whose goods were shipped across Asia and beyond. when the East India Company secured political influence in the region. It inherited more than territory. It inherited access to a treasury. Taxes collected from Bengal provided income that financed expansion. Administrative control allowed the company to regulate trade and gather revenue with efficiency that was new to British interests. This created a new kind of empire, one where political authority generated profit. Company officials established systems to manage income, record accounts, and control trade routes. Ships carried silks, cotton, saltpetre, spices, and other goods from Indian ports to British docks. The company sold these materials for high prices, and the earnings funded further investment. This was economic momentum at imperial scale. Every shipment turned into revenue, and the income shaped Britain as much as it reshaped India. The fortunes gained abroad did not stay abroad. They returned as wealthy men, transformed by the opportunities that the empire provided. They purchased country estates and renovated old houses into symbols of their success. They bought land in rural Britain and adopted the lifestyle of the upper classes. They sought the status that wealth could buy. In doing so, they altered British society. With their fortunes, they entered circles once reserved for landed aristocrats. Some bought formal titles. Others married into noble families. Their estates stood as physical proof that wealth could open doors once closed to those without lineage. Birth still mattered, but money, especially money from India, could rival it. Country houses displayed imported luxuries. Rooms filled with Indian textiles. Sideboards held silverwork crafted in workshops thousands of miles away. Spice jars and lacquered boxes sat alongside English furniture, blending domestic tradition with objects acquired abroad. These homes were decorated with the story of empire. Paintings, ornaments, and furnishings signaled not only taste, but connection. The owners of these estates could walk through halls lined with evidence of their overseas influence. Visitors saw wealth not as rumor, but as reality. The prosperity of the East India Company became visible in drawing rooms and galleries, in manicured gardens and libraries stocked with books acquired through the fortunes of foreign trade. Meanwhile, the company expanded its financial networks. It established systems that linked Indian revenue to British banks. Credit arrangements and investment partnerships grew in number. The income from the subcontinent strengthened the City of London, enabling further overseas ventures. This wealth supported industries, funded infrastructure, and shaped decisions in Parliament. India did not simply enrich individuals. It enriched institutions. Company shareholders gained influence. Members of government learned to consider the financial implications of decisions made thousands of miles from Westminster. The connection between India and Britain became structural. Revenues collected in Bengal paid for military campaigns. Trade supported naval supply lines. British goods circulated in Indian markets, creating a commercial loop that tied the two regions together. The company acted as both ruler and merchant, blending governance with profit. It shaped laws, directed trade, and managed taxation. This dual identity gave it a kind of authority that neither state nor business had held on its own. Life in India changed as a result. Markets adjusted to the demands of export. Traditional systems of production shifted to meet the needs of distant buyers. Administration became organized around revenue, not regional development. Financial priorities influenced local conditions. The structure of that wealth defined policy. The Compania's authority allowed funds to flow outward while decisions flowed inward. By the late 18th century, the scale of what had happened was unmistakable. Britannia's global position strengthened in part because of income from India. The East India Company was no longer only a commercial enterprise. It was a political force. It held armies. It negotiated treaties. It shaped the world it profited from. Company officials walked through London with fortunes that could influence politics, purchase loyalty, or reshape social hierarchy. Wealth became a form of power that stretched from English country houses to administrative offices in Calcutta. This era revealed how commerce could fuel empire. The exchange of goods became the exchange of influence. The collection of revenue became the engine of expansion. The flow of riches from Bengal into Britain changed both places. In Britain, it altered class, architecture, investment, and ambition. In India, it reshaped governance, trade, and the structure of daily life. The consequences of that connection did not end in 1800. They continued to echo through the decades that followed. Between 1757 and 1800, the rise of the East India Company demonstrated that empire could be built not only on territory, but on economics. Wealth became strategy. Profit became policy. India's resources and revenue became part of Britannia's ascent. The estates, titles, and drawing rooms of England reflected this new reality. Colonial success became a lifestyle. And the flow of riches became the foundation on which a new world of imperial power was built. The Caribbean Connection 1700 to 1833. In the early 18th century, the Caribbean became one of the most valuable regions in the British imperial system. On islands scattered across warm seas, plantations produced sugar, rum, tobacco, and coffee. These products traveled across the Atlantic to Britain, where they filled markets and households. In London, Bristol, and Liverpool, merchants handled shipments that arrived in barrels, crates, and casks. The profits were enormous, and they shaped the lives of those who had never seen the islands where the goods originated. Sugar became a cornerstone of British consumption. It appeared in bakeries, kitchens, and tea services across the country. Rum flowed into taverns and shipping routes. Tobacco found a place in growing commercial culture. Coffee arrived in city coffeehouses where business and politics intertwined. The products became everyday items, but their origins remained thousands of miles away in a world many in Britain would never visit. Plantation ownership created fortunes. Investors in Britain purchased land and managed estates through overseers and agents. Wealth moved across the Atlantic through ledgers and contracts. The profits returned home and reshaped the countryside. In counties like Gloucestershire, Yorkshire, and Devon, new houses appeared. In London, townhomes expanded with renovated fronts and decorative interiors. In Scotland and Ireland, estates grew with new wings and landscaped gardens. These were not small changes. Ballrooms were added to impress guests. Stables were built to hold horses for travel, racing, and hunting. Libraries filled with imported books lined the walls of quiet rooms. Gated driveways and sculpted lawns reflected the confidence of families whose wealth had come from far beyond Britain's shores. Although these buildings were symbols of prestige, their foundation was tied to Caribbean commerce. Throughout the 1700s, the scale of production in the Caribbean increased. More land, more crops, more shipments. Ports expanded to handle export goods. British ships carried raw sugar back to refineries on the Thames and the Mersey. Distilleries grew to meet the need for rum. Business networks developed between ports in the Caribbean and dockside warehouses in England. Trade created not only wealth, but influence. Families whose fortunes began with imported sugar later became investors, bankers, and politicians. The structure of plantation society was built on a system that imposed control over labor, movement, and daily life. People who worked on plantations lived under rules they did not choose, with limited freedoms determined by those who owned the estates. Their labor sustained the commerce that moved through British ports. Without that labor, the trade network would have collapsed. The prosperity visible in Britain was inseparable from the conditions that existed in the Caribbean. By the late 18th century, public conversations about morality, economics, and empire began to deepen. Reports of plantation life reached Britain. Movements formed that challenged the system and called for change. Newspapers carried arguments from both sides. The tension grew slowly at first, then rapidly. Yet even as debate rose, wealth continued to travel across the Atlantic. Ships still arrived at British docks with sugar and rum. Investors still profited. Architecture still expanded in quiet countryside estates. As the 19th century began, the system entered a period of transition. Discussions in Parliament widened. Pressure increased. By the early 1830s, the question was no longer whether change would come, but when. In 1833, slavery was abolished across the British Empire. The moment marked a turning point, legally and politically. But by then, many fortunes had already been established. Wealth built during the previous century remained in place. The architecture of that wealth did not disappear. Houses funded by Caribbean profits continued to stand. Some became museums. Others remained private homes. Some faded into obscurity. Others survived as part of local heritage. Their walls, staircases, and gardens held the memory of an era that shaped them. Each building offered a silent record of the connection between distant plantations and British prosperity. In towns and villages, people passed these structures without always knowing the source of the funds that built them. Marble fireplaces, imported wood paneling, and decorative ceilings reflected a history that reached beyond local borders. The story of the Caribbean connection was not written only in ports or plantations. It was written in drawing rooms, in estates surrounded by quiet fields, and in cities whose growth depended on trade. This chapter of history formed a link between economies, landscapes, and lives. It connected labor in the Caribbean to leisure in the countryside. It shaped industries that continued after the era itself ended. Even after abolition, the influence of that period remained in investments, in property, and in the built environment that still stands. From 1700 to 1833, the Caribbean played a central role in Britannia's development. Not a marginal role. Not a distant contribution. A central one. The products that arrived from the island supported systems of finance, shipping, and consumption. They influenced taste and culture. They allowed families to rise within society. They changed the landscape of Britain in visible and lasting ways. The era ended, but its impact did not vanish. It remained in architecture. In inherited wealth. In collections of documents and ledgers. In country houses that appear peaceful today, but whose origins lead back across the sea. Many fortunes were made. Many lives were altered. And homes across Britain still stand as quiet reminders of that connection. The Caribbean had shaped Britain. And the reminders are still standing. Liverpool, Bristol, and the port cities between 1750 and 1850 stand as gateways to a changing world. Their harbors fill with the sound of ropes tightening, sails folding, crates dropping onto docks, and crews calling out across the water. Others depart carrying finished products and hopes of fortune. The ports become engines of wealth, linking Britain to distant markets through routes that circle the globe. Liverpool rises quickly. Its docks expand mile by mile as shipping traffic increases. Warehouses line the waterfront, brick walls holding cargo from the Caribbean and North America. Sugar, cotton, timber, and rum pass through customs houses before continuing inland. Merchants negotiate contracts in counting rooms overlooking the river, their ledgers filled with transactions that connect their city to other continents. From the wharf to the exchange floor, commerce flows like a tide. Bristol shares this story, though with its own character. The merchants operate with long experience, trading across the Atlantic and beyond. The city spreads outward as wealth increases. New streets appear. Shopfronts display imported goods. Office buildings rise to manage the complexity of expanding trade. Like Liverpool, Bristol grows into a place where local identity intertwines with global networks. Both cities shape the financial landscape of Britain. Money earned at sea does not stay at the water's edge. It moves inland. Merchants invest in banks, insurance companies, and shipping firms. They expand into property ownership. Countryside estates rise from the profits made in docks and warehouses. Fields, manors, and landscaped gardens owe their existence not to ancient inheritance, but to trade. Houses are named after ships that crossed oceans or after the families that funded the journeys. Architecture becomes a monument to maritime wealth. Inside these estates, portraits hang in grand halls. They represent generations of investors, captains, and traders whose decisions ripple across oceans. Libraries contain maps of trade routes, letters from shipmasters, and ledgers tracking cargo. The luxury of peaceful estates contrasts with the restless world that financed them. The river, the harbor, and the ocean remain present even in quiet rural air. The wealth of the ports travels inland in stone and soil. In the cities, docks transform into districts of intense labor. Stevedores load and unload ships in all seasons. Coopers craft barrels for sugar and rum. Rope makers twist miles of hemp for rigging. Sailmakers stitch canvas that will face storms and months at sea. The port economy depends on thousands of hands, each task essential to the departure of a vessel. Liverpool and Bristol become places of opportunity and hardship, where fortunes are made and lost in the same breath. Infrastructure evolves to support the volume of trade. Liverpool develops its system of enclosed docks, allowing constant loading regardless of tides. Bristol improves navigation along the Avon to reduce delays. These advancements increase the speed of exchange. More ships arrive. More goods depart. The ports do not simply accommodate trade. They drive it forward. Their innovations influence other coastal towns and reshape expectations of maritime efficiency. As trade grows, so does the need for institutions. Insurance firms assess the risk of storms, war, and distant harbors. Banks handle deposits from merchants and investments from gentry. Legal offices arrange shipping contracts and charters. The port cities become business centers as much as maritime hubs. Their influence stretches into London, Manchester, Glasgow, and beyond. Decisions made in a waterfront office can affect markets on multiple continents. The social structure of the cities reflects this prosperity. Fine homes appear in new neighborhoods, built by merchant families who wish to display their success. Assembly rooms host gatherings where business and status mingle. Behind it lies an economy that relies on long voyages, unpredictable seas, and constant risk. Meanwhile, the countryside feels the impact. Estates expand. Some are redesigned in the latest architectural styles. Others add wings, gardens, or galleries paid for by overseas profit. Rural communities witness the arrival of new owners, whose fortunes were not built on farming, but on navigation charts and shipping manifests. The traditional image of landed wealth changes as trade replaces inheritance as a source of influence. Through the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution strengthens the connection between port and factory. Cotton from overseas feeds mills in Lancashire. Manufactured goods return to the harbors and sail to markets abroad. Metal from Birmingham and tools from Sheffield pass through Liverpool and Bristol on their way to other continents. The ports become links between the industrial heartland and the wider world. Without them, production would have nowhere to go. Without production, the ports would lose their purpose. Industry and maritime trade evolve as one. By 1850, the transformation is clear. Liverpool has become one of the busiest ports in the world. Bristol remains a central hub of Atlantic commerce. Country estates stand as reminders of where the money traveled once it left the docks. The architecture of wealth is seen not only in city skylines and brick warehouses, but in manor houses, landscaped parks, and the quiet symbols of prosperity built far from the sea. The identity of these port cities becomes inseparable from Britain's connection to global markets. The docks and harbors are not just places of arrival and departure. They are places where the world meets Britain, and where Britain reaches beyond its shores. Every street along the waterfront, every harbor warehouse, every ledger in a merchant's office is part of a larger story. Liverpool, Bristol, and the port cities between 1750 and 1850 do not stand still. They expand. They adapt. They define an era in which Britain becomes tied to the world through trade. Their history is written in cargo lists, ships' logs, and the brick walls of warehouses. It is the network of ships, docks, and trade routes that shaped these cities and the nation they served. London's influence and the aristocratic web 1800 to 1900 begins in offices lit by gas lamps and fueled by ambition. Between the early 19th century and the turn of the 20th, London became the financial brain of an expanding empire. Streets near the Thames filled with counting houses, merchant banks, and insurance firms. Ledgers tracked goods crossing oceans. Contracts reached from the city's heart to ports in India, Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. London was no longer just a capital. It was a command center. Bankers financed trade in India, supporting companies that moved textiles, tea, and spices through the Empire-esque commercial corridors. Insurance companies protected shipping fleets traveling from Bombay to Calcutta to London, ensuring that storms, piracy, or misfortune would not break the flow of profit. Government offices wrote laws that shaped economies abroad. In these rooms, decisions were made that affected millions who would never see the city making choices for them. This influence radiated outward. Wealth collected in London's financial districts filtered beyond the city. It settled into estates and private homes owned by those who had prospered from imperial work. Country houses rose like monuments to success. In Surrey, Kent, and Berkshire, large estates expanded across rolling fields. New wings were added to manors. Gardens were reshaped into landscaped symbols of prestige. These homes reflected status, not inherited from centuries of family lineage, but earned through service to the empire. A new generation of elites emerged during this century. They were not born into aristocracy. They built their fortunes through administration, commerce, and investment. Their social rise came not from ancient titles, but from connections woven through business and government. They attended receptions where alliances were made with a handshake. They married into older aristocratic families, blending inherited status with newly acquired power. The union of old and new wealth created a web of influence that stretched across Britain. In London, the social world evolved alongside the financial one. Clubs in districts like Pall Mall and St. James's hosted officers returning from service in India or Africa. Drawing rooms echoed with conversations about trade routes, legal reforms, and distant territories. The empire did not simply exist overseas. It lived in the conversations that drifted through these hallways like cigar smoke. Even those who never traveled outside Britain felt connected to the imperial network. Railway investors profited from lines built abroad. Shipbuilders in Glasgow and Belfast depended on contracts signed in London. Manufacturers in the Midlands sold goods to markets opened through colonial administration. The empire joined lives that were oceans apart, creating a shared economy that few fully understood but many benefited from. Government offices added their weight to the structure. Administrators drafted policies that shaped land use. taxation, and trade in places far from Londona's foggy mornings. Reports arrived in envelopes stamped with foreign postmarks. Decisions left Britain sealed in wax and returned months later as realities for people on the other side of the world. It was bureaucracy as power, conducted through paper and ink. The wealth that flowed through London reshaped British society. Estates near the capital became symbols of imperial administration, just as military bases and government buildings represented it abroad. The presence of empire reached into every layer of life. From the carriages that traveled country roads to the universities training the next generation of civil servants. Education prepared young men for overseas appointments. Etiquette reinforced hierarchy. Marriage aligned interests. The aristocratic web that emerged in the 19th century was not a simple hierarchy. It was a network of influence. Former military officers sat on boards of companies. Bankers met with ministers. Colonial governors returned home to advisory positions. Families built wealth that would sustain them long after their careers ended. Connections created power, and power created more connections. Walking through London at the end of the century revealed the results. Banks with grand facades. Law courts with columns inspired by classical architecture. Hotels where colonial officials stayed during their visits. Streets that bore the names of ports, provinces, and men who had once governed them. The Empire's geography appeared in the city like a shadow map, visible in stone and street signs. Meanwhile, in the countryside, estates reflected the new identity of Britannia's upper class. These were not simple farmhouses or medieval halls. They were homes designed to impress. Libraries filled with travel accounts and trade records. Studies decorated with maps pinned to polished walls. Portraits of uniformed relatives stationed abroad looked down from above fireplaces. The houses seemed to speak a quiet message. The empire was not only a project of government. It was a project of families. By 1900, the transformation was complete. The empire fed its banks with trade and taxation. The insurance industry protected its ships. The government managed its laws. The wealth generated outwardly reshaped the social landscape inwardly. The aristocratic web that emerged during this time was built on profit, policy, and proximity to power. A new elite class rose, not from the old world of hereditary lineage, but from the world the empire created. They existed in the space between aristocracy and commerce. They drew authority from their success rather than their ancestry. But in time, their children and grandchildren would inherit the benefits just as previous generations had inherited land and title. London's influence did not end at the city's boundary. It reached outward to estates, institutions, and networks that continued long after the 19th century closed. The aristocratic web it constructed survived the fall of empire. Its structure remained in relationships, titles, and wealth. The empire ended. The patterns of influence endured. A world where power did not disappear. It reorganized itself. Architecture built by empire. The journey begins at the gates of a grand estate. Where gravel paths lead toward a mansion framed by tall windows, stone pillars, and carved archways. At first glance, it appears simply as a country home, a symbol of wealth and stability. But step inside, and the building reveals more than elegance. It reveals a map of the world. Each room holds materials, objects, and designs that did not originate here. They traveled across oceans, passing through ports, markets, and trade routes before arriving in these halls as signs of status. As signs of status. The architecture of these homes becomes a silent archive of empire. Walking through these mansions revealed the global reach of their owners. In one drawing room, a fireplace carved from Indian marble reflects candlelight along polished surfaces. Its stone was cut, carried, and shipped from the subcontinent to Britain, a journey measured not just in distance but in influence. The patterns carved into it show a mixture of styles, where British tastes meet South Asian craftsmanship. The fireplace does more than warm the room. It tells a story of connection, ambition, and networks built across continents. Nearby, Caribbean mahogany doors line the hallways. Their deep reddish color glows beneath layers of wax and varnish. And their grain curves like waves frozen in time. Behind each door is a reminder that forests were felled. Shipped as lumber, transformed by carpenters, and installed here not just for function but for display. These doors are thresholds not only between rooms, but between worlds. They mark where distant landscapes meet domestic architecture. Behind each door is a reminder that forests were felled. Shipped as lumber, transformed by carpenters, and installed here not just for function but for display. These doors are thresholds not only between rooms, but between worlds. They mark where distant landscapes meet domestic architecture. In parlors and sitting rooms, shelves are filled with Chinese porcelain. Blue and white patterns depict mountains, rivers, and mythical beasts. Teacups rest beside matching saucers, displayed with pride. They arrived in ships that followed carefully plotted routes, loaded with fragile cargo wrapped in straw and packed in crates. To the visitors who saw them, these objects were not simple decorations. They were evidence of reach, proof that the owners had connections that stretched beyond Europe. In these rooms, porcelain becomes a symbol of cultural encounter, transformed into luxury. African ivory appears in smaller details, in decorative carvings on mantels, mirrors, and furniture. It may form the handle of a cabinet, the inlay of a writing desk, or the trim on a framed painting. It stands as another story built into the architecture, a reminder that Imperia's material legacy is not only large and obvious, but small and often overlooked. These fragments carry histories that are easy to ignore, yet they remain part of the world these houses represent. Every imported material was a story. Every decorated room was a map of the empire. The walls may have been built in Britain, but the identity of the building was assembled from dozens of places. Timber, stone, textiles, ceramics, and metalwork arrived in pieces, like chapters of a book that only form meaning when placed together. The architecture becomes an atlas, where hallways point toward the Caribbean, staircases suggest India, and dining rooms whisper of China and Africa. The scale of these estates was made possible by wealth generated across global trade. Profits flowed through ports in London, Liverpool, Bristol, and Glasgow. The rooms that display imported goods are also rooms that display the results of overseas business. The furniture is heavy with history. The floors creak with memory. Even the silence in these halls feels like a chapter left open. Grand entryways lead to high ceilings and chandeliers imported from European workshops. Walls are lined with silk wallpaper that traveled from looms thousands of miles away. Libraries are filled with books bound in leather, with atlases and journals describing the wider world. The house becomes a museum of ownership, a place where geography, politics, and architecture merge into one. The building is not just a residence. It is a declaration. Luxury lived in these houses, but so did history. But so did history. It lingers in the corners of stairwells. In the grooves of banisters handled by generations of guests. It sits in the fine china arranged for evening dinners. It stands in the portraits of families who commissioned these mansions to prove that their success was permanent. Yet the architecture also carries a quieter truth. It reminds us that the benefits of empire were not evenly shared. The wealth that allowed these homes to exist came from networks that stretched beyond the walls, touching people and places far beyond the estate grounds. Outside, landscaped gardens reflect ideals imported from other cultures. Fountains draw the eye toward long paths. Statues stand like guardians of memory. Greenhouses hold plants from distant climates, nurtured under glass to survive in foreign soil. These gardens become another form of architecture, where nature is shaped into elegance as carefully as stone and wood. Even the service areas tell a story. Kitchens built underground or behind the main hall show the organized structure of labor that maintained luxury. Storage rooms for imported goods remind us that this lifestyle depended on continuous supply. Corridors behind the walls allowed staff to move unseen, making the house function like a well-designed machine. Architecture becomes a system of visibility and invisibility, defining who is seen and who is not. As the centuries pass, many of these houses remain standing. Some are museums. Some are private homes. Some have faded quietly into the countryside. But each one holds its history in place, whether acknowledged or not. To walk their floors is to walk across a map of the 18th and 19th centuries. To touch their walls is to touch a world shaped by trade, ambition, and transformation. Architecture built by empire is more than design. It is evidence. It is memory preserved in wood, stone, and ivory. It shows how global connections reached into drawing rooms and country halls. It proves that history is not always written in books. Sometimes it is built, room by room, until the walls themselves speak. These mansions stand today as reminders. They remind us that beauty and ambition often share space with consequence. They remind us that the past survives in architecture, even when the world outside has changed. And they remind us that every object in these rooms once traveled across oceans before coming to rest in the shadow of a grand country house. Between 1760 and 1900, a wave of industrial wealth reshaped Britain. The Industrial Revolution unlocked new forms of power drawn not from royal decree or ancient landholding, but from machines, factories, and global supply. Steam engines roared in workshops, chimneys lined the skylines of cities, and iron rails cut across the countryside. Industrialization did not remain within the borders of Britain. It reached outward, demanding resources from across the empire. The world became a network of extraction, production, and profit, and Britain stood at the center of it. Cotton from India became the lifeblood of textile mills in Manchester. Shipments arrived in Liverpool where warehouses filled with bales ready for transport by rail. From there, machinery turned raw fiber into cloth that flowed back into global markets. Spinning frames and power looms operated day and night, their rhythm echoing across factory floors. The success of these mills depended on a constant stream of material from overseas. Industrial progress at home meant reliance on distant fields abroad. Metals from Africa fed the demands of Birmingham's foundries and workshops. Copper, iron, and later minerals essential to new technologies entered the ports and were distributed to factories. The city became a workshop for the world, its identity welded to the empire's resource routes. Industrial strength required global supply, and the empire provided it. Railways accelerated this transformation. Tracks connected ports to manufacturing centers, forming a circulatory system for the industrial economy. Coal from northern mines powered steam engines that pulled loaded freight cars through twisting valleys and over high bridges. Goods moved faster than ever before. Cotton, metals, timber, and food could reach factories in days instead of weeks. The railway was not just a tool of transportation. It was a conveyor belt for wealth. Steamships made this network global. Iron hulls and modern engines reduced travel time across oceans. The ports of London, Liverpool, and Glasgow became gateways to distant territories. Cargo lists stretched further than maps once imagined. Ships left British waters laden with machinery, textiles, and industrial goods, and returned with the materials needed to fuel the factories again. Industrialization and empire became reflections of each other. One demanded resources. The other supplied them. This system created fortunes unlike those of earlier centuries. Wealth no longer flowed only from land or inheritance. It came from steam, iron, and the coordination of trade. A new generation of industrial elites emerged. They built mansions on the outskirts of cities or in countryside retreats. Not as medieval fortresses but as modern palaces designed to display success. Ornamental gardens, glass conservatories, galleries of imported art, and rooms furnished by profits from manufacturing turned these estates into symbols of industrial achievement. These homes were not built to preserve tradition. They were built to demonstrate arrival. London became more than a capital. It became a financial engine that organized industrial wealth. Banks supplied credit to factory owners. Insurance companies protected cargo and machinery. Stock exchanges channeled investment into railways, mines, and trade companies. Decisions made in boardrooms shaped the lives of workers across continents. Wealth concentrated in the city even as the materials that fed it came from far beyond Britannia's borders. The lives of workers across continents. For industrialists, opportunity felt limitless. Machines increased output. Expanding markets promised profit. Telegraph lines carried messages across oceans, shrinking time. Distance no longer seemed like a barrier. The empire formed a supply chain. The industrial wealth wave was not an isolated surge. It was the creation of an interconnected world. But this prosperity was uneven. Factories offered employment yet often paid wages that barely sustained the workers who powered them. Pollution hung above industrial cities, leaving soot on windowsills and smoke in the air. Railways and shipping created opportunity for some and pressure for others. The same system that built mansions also crowded tenement neighborhoods. The same mills that filled Investorsa accounts demanded long hours from laborers who saw little of the profit. Industrial progress carried both advancement and cost, and the divide between the two became more visible with every passing decade. Still, the momentum of industry continued. New technologies emerged. Steam engines improved. Machinery grew more complex. The need for raw materials only increased as factories multiplied. Africa provided metals and minerals. Canada and Australia supplied timber and wool. Each region became part of a structure that kept British industry moving. The empire was not just territory. It was infrastructure. It was pipeline. It was fuel for machines. Each region became part of a structure that kept British industry moving. India remained a crucial supplier of cotton. Africa provided metals and minerals. Canada and Australia supplied timber and wool. Each region became part of a structure that kept British industry moving. The empire was not just territory. It was infrastructure. It was pipeline. It was fuel for machines. Each region became part of a structure that kept British industry moving. India remained a crucial supplier of cotton. Africa provided metals and minerals. Canada and Australia supplied timber and wool. Each region became part of a structure that kept British industry moving. The empire was not just territory. It was infrastructure. It was pipeline. It was fuel for machines. Each region became part of a structure that kept British industry moving. India remained a crucial supplier of cotton. Africa provided metals and minerals. Canada and Australia supplied timber and wool. Each region became part of a structure that kept British industry moving. The empire was not just territory. It was infrastructure. It was pipeline. It was fuel for machines. Each region became part of a structure that kept British industry moving. India remained a crucial supplier of cotton. Africa provided metals and minerals. Canada and Australia supplied timber and wool. Each region became part of a structure that kept British industry moving. The empire was not just territory. It was infrastructure. It was pipeline. It was fuel for machines. Each region became part of a structure that kept British industry moving. India remained a crucial supplier of cotton. Africa provided metals and minerals. Canada and Australia supplied timber and wool. Each region became part of a structure that kept British industry moving. The empire was not just territory. It was infrastructure. It was pipeline. It was fuel for machines. Each region became part of a structure that kept British industry moving. India remained a crucial supplier of cotton. Africa provided metals and minerals. Canada and Australia supplied timber and wool. By the end of the 19th century, industrial wealth had created a new identity for Britain. It was no longer only a kingdom of farms, estates, and traditional hierarchy. It was a nation of engines, financial houses, ports, and railways linking the countryside to the coast. The empire supported this transformation, and the industrial wealth wave supported the empire in return. Factories relied on overseas supply. Overseas supply relied on industrial demand. It was a cycle that turned raw materials into capital and capital into influence. Between 1760 and 1900, the Industrial Revolution reshaped the world and redefined the meaning of wealth. It created fortunes large enough to rival aristocracy. It built a second generation of grand homes, not made for defense but for display. Not medieval castles, but modern palaces for modern power. And through that machinery, Britain entered a new age driven by engines, fueled by empire, and carried forward on the rising tide of industrial wealth. When Queen Victoria inherited the throne in 1837, Britain stood at the edge of transformation. The Industrial Revolution had already begun remaking factories and cities. But a new era was forming. It was an age of confidence, display, and ambition. Under her reign, the empire reached its largest size. Maps shaded in red wrapped around continents. And the reach of British influence seemed to stretch farther than the horizon itself. At home, this expansion took physical form in stone, marble, glass, and iron. At home, this expansion took physical form in stone, marble, glass, and iron. Architecture evolved into statements of power. Mansions grew into sprawling estates. Halls expanded into galleries that echoed with footsteps. Winter gardens filled with exotic plants stood beneath glass roofs supported by iron beams. Libraries were built floor to ceiling with polished wood and towering bookshelves. Staircases curved like sculptures, designed not just for use, but to be seen. Inside, rooms reflected the age of innovation. Electric lights replaced gas lamps in the grandest estates. Modern plumbing brought clean water to upper floors. Telegraph lines connected cities and countries, shrinking distances in a way that would have been unthinkable just decades earlier. Every improvement seemed to promise progress, modernity, and control. The architecture of the age projected the belief that the future belonged to Britain. Yet beneath the refined surfaces, another story existed. The foundations of these homes were often financed by profits earned far beyond Britannia's borders. Income from India supported shipping companies whose owners built coastal estates. Resources from Africa fed industrial networks that supplied wealth to merchants who purchased country properties. Caribbean trade provided capital that maintained generations of aristocratic comfort. Even as technology advanced, Old economic structures continued to shape the world that made such advances possible. Large estates began to resemble miniature kingdoms. Stable blocks housed carriages and horses for leisure rides across private land. Conservatories displayed plants brought from tropical climates, leaves shining beneath warm light. Kitchens buzzed with staff, bound to schedules created by service rather than sunlight. Every detail displayed the confidence of wealth. But wealth never appeared without origin. Much of it traced back to the empire. In growing cities, architecture rose to match the countryscity's grandeur. London unveiled government buildings with pillars and arches that suggested permanence. Liverpool and Glasgow built shipping offices and export warehouses with polished stone facades. Manchester and Birmingham developed civic halls that signaled industrial power. Even train stations became monuments, with iron arches and glass roofs that glimmered like cathedrals of motion. The empire's presence was woven into the walls. For many Victorians, progress felt unstoppable. Telegraph messages crossed oceans. Steamships shrank the world's boundaries. Railways connected mines, ports, and cities. Resources drawn from across the empire. Cotton from India feeding textile mills. Minerals from Africa supplying foundries. Timber, sugar, tea, and spices flowing through ports. Every arrival supporting the comfort of the domestic world. Within drawing rooms, society gathered under chandeliers that scattered light across polished floors. Musicians played in parlors while conversations drifted toward distant regions that shaped fortunes. Conversations drifted toward distant regions that shaped fortunes. The Victorians regarded their age as proof of advancement, but the advancement rested on a structure they did not always see. Elegance existed because expansion existed. Beauty and comfort arrived because someone paid for them somewhere else. The architecture of the era preserved this truth quietly. Look closely at a country house. And the story appears in details. Imported marble for floors. Mahogany from distant forests shaped into banisters. Porcelain, carpet, and silk brought from global trade networks. Decorative motifs borrowed from lands under British authority. The buildings acted as museums of empire. Even when the owners did not acknowledge it. By the 1880s, the empire stood at its highest point. The Victorian world felt secure. But hints of tension appeared. Nationalist movements abroad questioned control. Economic competition increased. Even at home, industrial workers challenged the idea that progress benefited all equally. The mansions remained beautiful, but the world beyond their gates was changing. As Victoria's reign approached its end, the architecture remained magnificent, but it also became a reminder. A reminder of where prosperity came from. A reminder that comfort had a cost. A reminder that beauty did not appear without consequence. The estates continued to host dinners and dances. Electric lamps glowed. Gardens bloomed beneath glass roofs. When the 19th century turned toward the 20th, Britain still stood at the center of a vast global network. But the questions that had remained quiet for decades began to speak more clearly. What would happen when expansion slowed? What would happen when others demanded their own future? What would Victorian grandeur represent when the system beneath it changed? The architecture did not answer these questions. It simply stood, silent and magnificent. Under Queen Victoria, the empire reached its greatest size. Mansions expanded. Cities transformed. Technology advanced. Elegance flourished. But their strength, their comfort, and their brilliance rested on the income of empire. Beauty was built. Comfort was enjoyed. And the foundations came from far beyond Britannia's shores. When empire collapsed between 1947 and 1960, The world that Britain once commanded changed faster than many believed possible. After the Second World War, the cost of global control grew heavier than the state could bear. Victory had come with a price. Cities needed rebuilding. Economies needed reconstruction. Trade networks had been broken or diverted. The treasury faced debts that stretched across decades. The empire, once a symbol of strength and expansion, now became a weight dragging a tired nation further down. In 1947, India gained independence. It was more than a political event. Marked the beginning of the end. For generations, India had been one of the financial pillars of imperial power, providing markets, administration, and revenue. Once it stepped away, the structure that surrounded it began to loosen. A door opened, and other nations would soon follow through it. Throughout the 1950s, colonies became nations. Ghana, Malaya, Nigeria, and others declared independence. Across the Caribbean and Africa, governments formed, flags changed, and parliaments rose where colonial offices once stood. London negotiated, adjusted, and attempted to maintain relationships through treaties and diplomacy rather than authority. The system that lasted centuries unraveled in a few decades, not through sudden collapse, but through steady departure. As new nations emerged, the financial world of Britain changed. For centuries, revenue from overseas territories helped support aristocratic estates and private fortunes. With independence, that income slowed or stopped. Estates that once relied on wealth from commerce abroad struggled to maintain themselves. Great houses found their upkeep too expensive. Staff were dismissed. Properties fell into disrepair. Landscapes once manicured to perfection grew wild. Some owners sold their land to the government, transferring historic estates into public hands. Others sold to private buyers or business investors looking for new uses. A few adapted their homes into hotels, educational centers, or private clubs. These buildings, once symbols of a global system, now serve new purposes. Some, unable to adapt, were abandoned. They stood silent, windows dark, corridors empty, grass reclaiming the gardens. In certain places, the state intervened to preserve these structures. They became museums, monuments to a world that no longer existed. Visitors walked through long halls and high staircases, seeing portraits and furnishings from a time when empires shaped everyday life. The estates became more than relics. They became physical memories, reminders of the ambitions and consequences of an age that ended in quiet transitions rather than dramatic collapse. Meanwhile, the identity of Britain began. The nation faced a reality in which it was no longer the center of a global network. London, still influential, turned toward diplomacy, finance, and international cooperation rather than imperial administration. Cities that once depended on imperial trade adjusted to new markets. Shipyards and docks that once shipped goods to colonies sought new purposes. Some adapted. Others declined. Meanwhile, the identity of Britain began to shift. People who built careers abroad returned home. Officers who administered territories found their positions dissolved. Merchant families whose business depended on preferential trade routes saw profits shrink. The social world of the elite narrowed. But the overseas reach that once reinforced their authority was gone. Influence that once extended across continents now rested within national borders. Parliament, once filled with debates about colonial exhibitions, policies, and oversight, now discussed social services, domestic rebuilding, and the changing position of Britain in the modern world. The era of managing empire shifted to the era of managing recovery. Not expansion, but adjustment. Not command, but cooperation. Yet the memory of empire remained, visible in architecture. In architecture, in archives, and in the great houses scattered across the countryside. They stood like monuments to another age. Their stone walls carried stories of officials, merchants, and officers. Their halls echoed with a past that still shaped landscapes and identities even as the world moved on. Between 1947 and 1960, the collapse of empire was not only a political transformation. It was a cultural and economic one. It reshaped the countryside as much as the capital. It altered the lives of the wealthy as much as the working class. It redefined Britain's place in the world. The collapse did not come from a single moment, but from a series of decisions, transitions, and departures. Empire faded. The estates remained. They became reminders of a structure that once stretched across oceans, run by forces that believed their world would last forever. Now they became museums, schools, hotels, or quiet private homes behind tall gates. The world outside had changed, and they could no longer command it. When empire collapsed, an era ended. Britain stepped into a new identity, shaped by memory but no longer ruled by it. The mansions remained, not as symbols of power, but as echoes of a world that once was. Legacy in the present day unfolds in quiet hallways and along garden paths where history still breathes softly. Across Britain, many mansions remain, their stone walls weathered by time but unbroken. Some rise behind iron gates, still privately owned. Others belong to trusts and foundations, preserved as windows into the past. A few operate as museums, hosting visitors who walk through rooms once filled with colonial maps, imported furniture, and portraits of families whose fortunes stretched across oceans. These mansions are not ruins. They are reminders. Their architecture speaks in details that most passers-by never notice. Marble fireplaces carved with symbols of trade. Ceilings adorned with patterns inspired by distant lands. Libraries containing travel journals, shipping logs, or old economic ledgers. Even when stripped of their original purpose, the buildings hold memory. The way the floors creak and the staircases curl upward like the spine of a story. Some estates sit in the countryside, surrounded by lawns where carriages once arrived after journeys from London. Guests would step out, carrying letters, reports, or investment contracts. Decisions made inside those rooms affected workers in factories, sailors on ships, and communities around the world. The empire ended long ago, but the houses remain like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence history has not fully finished. In other places, mansions stand near modern roads and railways. Traffic passes where horses once trotted. Tourists wait at bus stops outside gates that once opened only for those with titles or introductions. Time has changed the world around them, but their silhouettes remain the same. They do not demand attention. They simply exist, offering the past to those who are willing to look. Some are preserved as historical sites. Guides explain how fortunes were built, how estates expanded, and how families rose through ranks of administration and commerce. Visitors walk through rooms where globes sit beside ink-stained desks, where imported textiles hang beside British craftsmanship. In these places, the legacy is acknowledged through narration and reflection. The walls speak because people allow them to. Some remain private. Their stories are not shared. Curtains stay drawn. Ownership passes quietly from one generation to the next. These homes are not advertised as remnants of empire. Yet they stand because of histories that cannot be separated from wider global change. They are pieces of a puzzle scattered across the landscape, each holding a fragment of meaning. A few hold hidden stories. In attics where travel trunks gather dust. In gardens where statues face the sunrise. In servant corridors too narrow for comfort. Beauty and hardship existed side by side. Comfort upstairs depended on labor downstairs. Privacy for the owners meant invisibility for the workers who maintained the illusion. These mansions are reminders of a world that once existed. A world where wealth traveled across oceans. A world where ships carried goods to Britain and carried influence back out again. A world where financial success and cultural prestige could be built from faraway lands that most residents would never see. A world where the distance between privilege and struggle could be measured not in miles, but in walls. They are not just architectural artifacts. They are emotional ones. They ask questions that echo through time. Who benefited? Who paid? Who remembers? Their answers are not written in plaques or archived documents alone. They are felt in the contrast between polished floors and narrow servants' staircases. In the gap between portraits in gilded frames and the names of those never painted. Their answers are felt in the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Today, these estates exist in a different world. London is no longer the seat of a global empire, but the echo of its influence travels still. Visitors from former colonies walk through halls once owned by families who governed their homelands. Students from across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean study in universities funded by fortunes made during earlier centuries. Migration, globalization, and cultural exchange have rewritten the story. These houses now stand in a Britain shaped by change. A Britain that questions its past while living in its aftermath. A Britain surrounded by modern cities, diverse communities, and shifting identities. Some see them as heritage. Some see them as warning. Most see them as evidence of a truth that cannot be ignored. Beauty and power came at a price that not everyone paid equally. Legacy in the present day is not about judgment alone. It is about understanding. It is about acknowledging that history survives not just in books, but in buildings, customs, and memory. It is about seeing the past not as something distant, but as a foundation beneath the modern world. Across Britain, the mansions still stand. Some quiet. Some proud. Some uncertain. They hold stories carved into their walls, waiting for those who choose to listen. The world has changed. The architecture remembers. Thank you for listening and taking this journey through history with me. Colonial wealth in British mansions is not just about architecture or luxury. It is about connection, cost, and consequence. The empire is gone, but the buildings remain. Their walls are silent, but their history still speaks. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and take care.